Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably, and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through the woods, where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? The Lodge of Echoing Cries, a haunting in Blackwater Pines. In the summer of 1987, nestled deep within the dense woods of Blackwater Pines, Oregon, stood an abandoned hunting lodge known as the Lodge of Echoing Cries. Locals spoke of the eerie, guttural sounds that would echo through the forest on moonless nights. It was said that no one who ventured near the lodge after sundown ever came back the same, or at all. The lodge, built in 1924, was once a haven for hunters and nature enthusiasts. However, a tragedy in 1946 turned it into a ghostly relic. A hunting party of 5 men disappeared during a brutal snowstorm, their cries for help allegedly heard echoing through the woods for weeks afterward. When rescuers finally reached the lodge, all they found were torn bedding, shattered glass, and faint, bloody handprints smeared on the walls. The lodge was boarded up, abandoned, and left to decay, until a group of curious college students from Portland decided to investigate. It was a humid August evening when Lisa Carter, a journalism student obsessed with unsolved mysteries, convinced her 3 friends, Tommy, Rachel, and Chris, to join her on a weekend trip to Blackwater Pines. Armed with flashlights, tape recorders, and enough snacks to survive a zombie apocalypse, the group was ready for what they thought would be a spooky adventure. The journey to the lodge was unsettling. The road to Blackwater Pines was lined with skeletal trees, their twisted branches casting long, menacing shadows. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew thick and the cicada's song faded into an ominous silence. By the time they reached the lodge, it was nearly dark. The building loomed like a forgotten giant, its broken windows resembling hollow, unblinking eyes. The faint smell of mildew and decay wafted from its splintered wooden doors. The group hesitated, exchanging nervous glances, but Lisa's determination pushed them forward. Inside, the air was stifling, heavy with the scent of rot and old wood. The walls were covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, interrupted occasionally by strange, claw-like marks. As they ventured further, they noticed faded hunting trophies still hanging on the walls, their glassy eyes seemingly following their every move. "Guys, look at this," Chris called out, his voice echoing unervingly in the cavernous main hall. He pointed to a table where an old journal lay open, its yellowed pages filled with hurried, almost illegible handwriting. The final entry read, "Asterisk, if you're reading this, it means the echoes found you too. Don't listen to them. Don't answer. Run before it's too late. Asterisk." Just as Rachel finished reading the entry aloud, a chilling sound pierced the silence. A distant, mournful cry that seemed to come from the woods. It was faint at first but grew louder, closer, and more desperate, as if someone or something was calling for help. "Maybe it's just an animal," Tommy whispered, though his voice wavered with fear. Lisa shook her head. "That sounded like a person. We need to check it out." They followed the cries outside, the beam of their flashlights slicing through the oppressive darkness. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sound seemed to surround them, bouncing off the trees and making it impossible to tell which direction it was coming from. "Stop," Rachel said suddenly, grabbing Lisa's arm. "Listen." The cries had stopped. Now there was only silence, deafening, unnatural silence. Then a whisper, "Help me, came from behind them. They spun around, their flashlights trembling, to find nothing but the dark outline of the lodge looming in the distance. Lisa's voice quivered. "Let's go back inside. Now!" The group hurried back, their steps quick and uneven. But as they reached the lodge's threshold, they froze. The door, which they had left ajar, was now closed. From within, faintly, came the unmistakable sound of someone crying. The group exchanged panicked looks. "Who's in there?" Chris called out, his voice echoing like a challenge into the stillness. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against their ears. Then, the door creaked open, revealing only darkness inside. "Let's leave," Rachel whispered, but Lisa, clutching her tape recorder, stepped forward. "We came here to find the truth," she said, more to herself than anyone else. She pushed the door open fully, and they stepped inside once more, unaware that something was waiting for them. The air inside was colder now, and the faint scent of decay had grown stronger. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the lodge itself were amplifying the noise. Then, from deep within the lodge, came the whisper again. "Help me." It sounded like a child this time. "Who's there?" Lisa called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. A shadow moved at the end of the hallway, and the group froze. "Stay together," Tommy said, gripping Rachel's hand tightly as they inched forward, following the shadow deeper into the belly of the lodge. The group moved cautiously down the dimly lit hallway, their flashlights casting long, flickering beams of light on the warped wooden walls. The air grew colder with each step, a bone-chilling cold that made their breath visible despite the lingering summer warmth outside. "Do you hear that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. A faint scratching sound was coming from the end of the hallway. It was irregular, like nails dragging across wood in hesitant bursts. The group exchanged nervous glances before continuing forward, their footsteps creaking against the floorboards. At the end of the hall stood a door, slightly ajar. The scratching sound was louder now, more deliberate. Lisa hesitated, gripping her tape recorder tightly. "Maybe we should just turn around," Tommy said, his voice trembling. Lisa shook her head. "We need to see this through." She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside was a small room, almost entirely empty except for a broken rocking chair in the corner. The scratching sound abruptly stopped as their flashlights swept over the space. On the far wall, they saw something that made their stomachs drop. A series of deep, jagged scratches carved into the wood, forming crude symbols none of them recognized. "What is this?" Chris asked, stepping closer to examine the marks. Before anyone could answer, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Rachel screamed, and Tommy threw himself against the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. "Calm down," Lisa shouted, though her own voice wavered. "We're gonna figure this out." A low, guttural sound began to fill the room, growing louder and louder until it seemed to echo from all directions. It was a distorted mix of laughter and weeping, as if multiple voices were layered on top of each other. "Where is it coming from?" Chris yelled, spinning in place. Suddenly, the rocking chair in the corner began to move, rocking back and forth with increasing speed. The sound of the creaking wood was almost deafening in the confined space. "Lisa, do something," Rachel cried, tears streaming down her face. Lisa raised her tape recorder and pressed the record button, her hands shaking. "Who's here?" she asked, her voice cracking. The voices stopped abruptly, and the room fell into an oppressive silence. Then, a childlike voice whispered, so softly they almost missed it. "You shouldn't be here." The rocking chair stopped moving. The door behind them creaked open on its own, revealing the dark hallway once more. Without a word, the group bolted out of the room, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran back toward the entrance. But when they reached the main hall, the front door was gone. In its place was a solid wall of wood, as if the door had never existed. This can't be real, Tommy stammered, running his hands over the wall. We just came through here. It's like the lodge is shifting, Lisa said, her voice distant as she tried to process what was happening. It doesn't want us to leave. Rachel began to sob, her panic overtaking her. I told you this was a bad idea. I told you we shouldn't have come here. Lisa placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, trying to calm her. We'll find another way out. We just need to stay together. As they turned to search for another exit, a loud thud echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving toward the staircase. Upstairs, Chris said, his voice barely a whisper. Who else could be here? I don't think it's someone, Lisa replied, gripping her flashlight tighter. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the group froze. A moment later, a single loud knock came from above, reverberating through the lodge. Let's just get out of here, Tommy said, grabbing Rachel's hand and pulling her toward a side hallway. There's got to be another exit. Lisa and Chris followed, their flashlights illuminating the narrow corridor. The walls here were even more deteriorated, with large sections of plaster missing, revealing the wooden beams underneath. Strange symbols were scrawled across the surfaces, similar to the ones they had seen in the small room. The corridor led them to what appeared to be a kitchen. The air inside was stifling, and the metallic smell of rust filled their noses. Pots and pans hung from the walls, their surfaces blackened with age. On the counter sat a dusty, rusted knife block, the blade still gleaming faintly in the flashlight's beam. As they moved further in, the door behind them creaked shut. Chris spun around, but before he could reach for the handle, all the flashlights flickered and went out simultaneously, plunging them into darkness. Turn them back on, Rachel screamed, her voice rising in panic. I'm trying, Chris shouted, smacking his flashlight against his hand. Suddenly, a faint blue light filled the room. It emanated from the far corner, where a figure now stood. The light revealed only its silhouette, tall, impossibly thin, and contorted in a way that made it difficult to discern where its limbs began and ended. The figure moved, its steps slow and deliberate, the blue light pulsating with each motion. Run, Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. The group bolted for the door, fumbling to force it open as the figure grew closer. At the last second, Tommy managed to yank the door open, and they spilled out into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind them. What was that? Rachel cried, her voice breaking. Lisa didn't answer. She couldn't. All she could think about was the feeling she'd had in the presence of that figure. A deep, overwhelming dread, as if it had been staring straight into her soul. They didn't stop running until they reached the staircase leading to the second floor. As they paused to catch their breath, a faint sound reached their ears. The same childlike voice they had heard before, now singing a haunting, wordless melody. It was coming from upstairs. The group stood frozen at the base of the staircase, their breathing ragged as the eerie melody drifted down from the floor above. It was soft and haunting, each note lingering like a whisper in the air. No one wanted to speak, let alone move, but the oppressive silence beneath the song made standing still unbearable. Do we go up? Chris finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you out of your mind? Rachel hissed, her hands trembling. We should be looking for a way out, not heading straight toward whatever that is. Lisa, clutching her tape recorder tightly, spoke with a shaky but determined voice. "If we run without knowing what's happening, we'll never find a way out of here. Maybe there's something upstairs. Something that can explain this." She looked at each of them in turn, her expression resolute. "We need answers." Chris reluctantly nodded, while Tommy and Rachel exchanged nervous glances. "Fine," Tommy said, swallowing hard. "But if things get worse, we're turning around." The staircase groaned beneath their weight as they ascended, the old wood threatening to splinter with every step. The melody grew louder, more intricate, as if guiding them toward its source. When they reached the top, they found themselves in a long hallway, lined with closed doors on either side. The air here was colder, and the faint scent of mildew mixed with something metallic, like blood. "What is that smell?" Rachel muttered, covering her nose. Lisa ignored her, stepping cautiously toward the first door on the left. It was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. She pushed it open with trembling fingers, her flashlight illuminating a small bedroom. The furniture was overturned, the mattress slashed open, its stuffing spilling out like entrails. On the wall above the bed, more symbols were scrawled, these ones darker, as if burned into the wood. "What do you think these mean?" Chris asked, running his fingers over the marks. Lisa shook her head. "I don't know, but whoever or whatever left them, it feels like a warning." A soft thud from behind them made everyone jump. They spun around to see one of the doors at the end of the hallway slowly swinging open. The melody stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. "Did you see that?" Tommy whispered, his voice cracking. Lisa stepped forward, her tape recorder still running. "Stay behind me," she said, though her own fear was evident. They approached the open door cautiously, their flashlights trained on the darkness within. It was a larger room, filled with dusty furniture and a massive, cracked mirror hanging on the far wall. The mirror's surface was clouded, but faintly reflective, distorting their images into grotesque shapes. "Is this where the sound came from?" Rachel asked, gripping Tommy's arm tightly. Before anyone could answer, the mirror's surface rippled like water, and a pale face appeared within it. The face belonged to a child, a girl with hollow, sunken eyes and matted hair. She stared at them, unmoving, as if studying each of them in turn. "Help me," she said, her voice faint but clear. Rachel screamed, stumbling backward into Tommy, who caught her just before she fell. The girl's image flickered, her mouth moving again, though the sound came from all around them rather than the mirror. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice now colder, more menacing. Lisa stepped closer to the mirror, despite the protests of her friends. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What happened here?" The girl's face twisted into a sorrowful expression, and for a moment, it looked as though she might cry. "They took us," she whispered. "They hurt us. And now, we're part of it." "Part of what?" Lisa pressed, but the girl's image began to fade, her voice growing faint. "Leave, before it's too late." The mirror went still, reflecting only their pale, frightened faces. "What the hell was that?" Chris asked, his voice shaking. "I think it was a warning," Lisa said, turning away from the mirror. "We need to figure out what happened here." A deafening crash interrupted her, shaking the floor beneath their feet. It came from somewhere below, followed by the sound of shattering glass. The lodge seemed to groan in protest, as if it were alive. "Whatever it is, it's getting worse," Tommy said, pulling Rachel toward the hallway. "We need to find a way out. Now." Lisa hesitated, her journalistic instincts urging her to stay and uncover the truth. But the growing panic in her friend's eyes made her nod reluctantly. "Let's go." As they made their way back toward the staircase, The hallway seemed longer than before, the doors on either side stretching into the distance. The walls began to pulse faintly, as if the lodge itself had a heartbeat. "This wasn't here before," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "It's like the place is changing." They quickened their pace, but no matter how far they walked, the staircase remained out of reach. The air grew heavier, pressing against their chests, and the faint sound of the child's melody began again, this time accompanied by distant whispers. "Stop!" Lisa shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. The group froze, their flashlights darting around in the oppressive darkness. "We're being played with. We need to stay calm." Chris pointed ahead, his hand shaking. "Look!" The staircase was suddenly visible, only a few feet away. Without hesitation, they ran toward it, descending as quickly as they could. The lodge groaned again, the sound echoing through its halls, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. When they reached the main floor, they found themselves in a room they didn't recognize. It was large and circular, with no windows and only a single door on the far wall. The floor was covered in strange, intricate patterns carved into the wood, and in the center of the room stood an old, rotting chair. "What is this place?" Rachel asked, her voice barely audible. Lisa moved cautiously toward the chair, her tape recorder still running. As she approached, she noticed something glinting beneath it. She bent down and picked up a rusted locket, its chain broken. Opening it, she found a tiny photograph of a young girl, the same girl they had seen in the mirror. "She was real," Lisa said softly. "Something terrible happened here." Before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut behind them, and the whispers stopped. The room fell into an unnatural silence, broken only by the faint sound of footsteps approaching from outside. They weren't alone. The footsteps outside the door were slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, as if whatever was approaching carried the weight of the entire lodge. Each step sent vibrations through the wooden floor, a deep, resonant thud that made the group instinctively huddle closer together. "Do you think it's the girl?" Rachel whispered, though her voice betrayed little hope. "No," Lisa said quietly, staring at the door. "Whatever that is, it's not her." Chris stepped forward, gripping one of the rusted fireplace pokers he had grabbed from an earlier room. "We can't just sit here and wait. If it gets in, we're trapped. We need to find another way out." Lisa looked around the room, her flashlight scanning every surface. The circular patterns carved into the floor seemed to shift subtly under the light, as if they were alive. There were no windows, no other doors, only the one blocking their exit. "We can't break through the walls. They're too solid," Tommy said, his voice tense. "And the door's not going to hold forever." Lisa's eyes fell on the locket in her hand, and an idea began to form. "What if this place isn't just physical?" she said slowly. "The symbols, the shifting hallways, the way the lodge traps us. It's like it's feeding on something. Fear, maybe. Despair. Okay, but how does that help us?" Rachel asked, still clutching Tommy's arm. Lisa knelt down, her fingers tracing the patterns on the floor. "The girl said they're part of it. That means there's a connection between this place and whatever happened to her and the others. If we can figure out what ties them together, maybe we can break the lodge's hold." The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a moment, the group held their breath, waiting for the inevitable sound of it being forced open. But instead, there was only silence. "Maybe it's gone," Chris whispered. As if in answer, a deep, guttural growl reverberated through the room. The air grew heavy and cold, and the door began to splinter, as though unseen claws were raking against it from the other side. "Whatever you're planning, do it fast," Tommy said, backing away from the door. Lisa looked at the locket again, her heart racing. "We need to find out more about the girl. If she's tied to this place, Maybe she's the key to escaping. She stood and turned to the others. We're going back to the room with the mirror. Are you insane? Rachel snapped. We barely made it out of there. I don't think the lodge wants us to leave yet, Lisa said. If we try to run now, it'll just trap us again. We have to play by its rules, at least until we know enough to fight back. Chris nodded reluctantly, gripping the poker tighter. Fine, let's move. The group edged toward the door, their flashlights aimed at the splintering wood. As Lisa reached for the handle, the growling stopped. The room plunged into silence again, and the door creaked open on its own. No, Rachel whispered, stepping back. This is a trap. Everything here is a trap, Lisa replied. But we don't have a choice. The hallway beyond was darker than before, the air thick and humid. The faint melody began again, distant but insistent, guiding them back toward the mirror room. As they walked, the lodge seemed to shift around them. The walls rippled like water, and the floor creaked unnaturally, as though it were alive. The symbols they had seen earlier were now glowing faintly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. They reached the mirror room without incident, but the moment they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them. The cracked mirror flickered to life, and the girl's face appeared once more, her expression twisted with fear and pain. You came back, she said softly. Her voice echoed unnaturally, filling the room. We need your help, Lisa said, stepping closer to the mirror. What happened to you? Why are you here? The girl's image flickered, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might disappear again. Then she spoke, her voice trembling. They brought us here, said it was a safe place. But it wasn't. They changed us. Who's they? Lisa asked, her pulse pounding. The girl's hollow eyes seemed to pierce through Lisa. The ones who built this lodge. They made it so it could never let go. So they could keep feeding. Feeding on what? Chris asked, his grip on the poker tightening. The girl didn't answer. Instead, her face contorted in pain, and her voice grew sharp. They're coming. You have to stop them. Find the heart. Destroy it. The heart. Lisa repeated, but the girl's image began to fade, her words barely audible. Before it's too late, the mirror shattered, sending shards of glass flying across the room. The group ducked, shielding their faces, as the room was plunged into darkness. From somewhere deep within the lodge, a low, rumbling noise began to build, like the growl of an approaching storm. Heart? What heart? Rachel cried. What does that even mean? Lisa's mind raced. The lodge. It's alive. If there's a heart, it has to be the source of its power, the thing keeping it alive. How do we find it? Tommy asked, his voice tight with fear. Lisa looked down at the locket in her hand. The girl's photograph was still visible, though now it seemed to glow faintly. This has to be the key, she said. The girl was trying to lead us somewhere. The rumbling grew louder, and the walls of the room began to shake. The patterns carved into the floor flared with light, their intricate shapes shifting and rearranging into something new. Follow it, Lisa said, pointing at the glowing patterns. It's trying to show us the way. The group hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the glowing path. The light pulsed beneath their feet, guiding them out of the room and into a narrow, spiraling staircase that hadn't been there before. The staircase descended deep into the earth, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The rumbling sound followed them, growing louder as they neared the bottom. When they reached the end, they found themselves in a vast underground chamber. The walls were covered in the same glowing symbols, and in the center of the room stood a massive, pulsating mass of flesh and shadow. It throbbed with an unnatural rhythm, its surface glistening with dark, ichorous fluid. The heart, Lisa whispered. her voice barely audible over the sound of the beating organ. As they approached, the shadows around the heart began to move, coalescing into shapes, twisted humanoid figures with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. "They're protecting it," Chris said, gripping the poker tightly. The figures began to advance, their movements jerky and unnatural. "We have to destroy it," Lisa shouted. "Now!" Lisa's voice cut through the rising chaos as the shadowy figures moved closer. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and their bodies twitched unnaturally with every step. The heart in the center of the chamber pulsed faster, its grotesque rhythm echoing in their chests like a second heartbeat. "Cover me!" Chris shouted, brandishing the fireplace poker. He rushed toward the heart, but two of the shadowy figures lunged at him, their skeletal hands outstretched. He swung the poker wildly, knocking one back while the other clawed at his arm. Lisa grabbed the locket, holding it up as if it could shield them. She said, "This is the key. There has to be something it can do." Tommy and Rachel backed away, desperately searching for something. Anything that could be used as a weapon. Tommy grabbed a jagged shard of stone from the floor, while Rachel clutched a broken piece of wood from the staircase. "Lisa, figure it out fast," Tommy yelled, slamming the stone into one of the advancing figures. It let out a hollow, otherworldly shriek and dissolved into a swirl of dark mist. Lisa stared at the locket, her mind racing. The photograph of the girl glowed faintly, and as she turned it over in her hands, she noticed an inscription on the back. "End where it began." "The lodge," Lisa murmured. "It's the source. This place feeds on the past, on pain, on the people who were brought here." She looked at the heart, its pulsating mass almost hypnotic. "We have to destroy the lodge itself. This thing is its core." "How?" Rachel shouted, her voice trembling as she swung the piece of wood at another figure. The shadows seemed endless, more appearing with every strike. Lisa's eyes scanned the chamber, landing on the glowing patterns etched into the floor and walls. They pulsed in sync with the heart, forming a web that seemed to tether it to the room. "The symbols," she yelled. "They're binding it. If we break them, it might weaken the heart." "On it!" Tommy yelled, grabbing a heavy piece of debris. He began smashing the glowing carvings on the walls, each strike causing the heart to pulse erratically. The figures howled in unison, their movements growing more frantic. Chris managed to reach the heart, his poker raised high. He drove it into the fleshy mass with all his strength, and a deafening scream erupted from the heart itself. Black ichor sprayed across the room, burning like acid where it landed. "It's working," Lisa yelled, joining Tommy in destroying the glowing symbols. Rachel, emboldened by their progress, slammed her wooden weapon against the floor carvings, splintering them with each blow. The heart convulsed violently, its pulsations becoming erratic. The shadows began to retreat, their forms dissolving into the darkness. But the ground beneath them started to quake, cracks spidering through the floor and walls. "This whole place is coming down," Chris shouted, pulling the poker free and running back toward the group. Lisa turned to the others. "We have to finish this now. Keep going." As they destroyed the last of the symbols, the heart let out a final, ear-splitting scream. Its pulsations stopped, and it began to collapse in on itself, pulling the darkness of the chamber with it. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting, but the floor beneath them crumbled away, leaving them scrambling to stay upright. "Run!" Lisa screamed, leading the group back toward the staircase. The glowing path reappeared beneath their feet, guiding them upward as the chamber collapsed behind them. The lodge groaned and shifted, its walls and floors warping as though in agony. The group burst onto the main floor, where daylight now streamed through cracks in the walls. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Is it over?" Rachel asked, her voice shaky. Lisa held up the locket. The photograph of the girl had faded completely, leaving the frame empty. She closed it gently, nodding. "I think we broke its hold. The lodge can't hurt anyone anymore." The front door, which had vanished earlier, was now back in place, slightly ajar. Sunlight streamed through the gap, beckoning them outside. One by one, they stepped through the doorway, leaving the lodge behind. As they crossed the threshold, the building let out a final groan, and with a sound like a sigh, it collapsed inward, reduced to rubble and dust. They stood in silence, watching the remains of the lodge settle. The oppressive feeling was gone, replaced by a strange calm. The air smelled fresh for the first time, as though the land itself had been cleansed. "She's free," Lisa said softly, clutching the locket. "They all are." Tommy placed a hand on her shoulder. "You saved them. And us?" Rachel let out a shaky laugh. "Let's just promise we'll never do anything like this again." Chris nodded, tossing the fireplace poker aside. "Agreed." The group began their trek back to the car, the weight of their ordeal slowly lifting. As they walked, Lisa glanced back at the ruins of the lodge one last time. The girl's voice echoed faintly in her mind, a final whisper. "Thank you." For the first time since arriving, Lisa felt a sense of peace. They had survived, and more importantly, they had broken the cycle. The lodge of echoing cries was no more. As the group walked back to their car, the forest seemed different, less oppressive. The shadows that had once loomed over them now felt like ordinary shade cast by trees swaying gently in the breeze. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, a sound they hadn't heard since arriving. The sensation of being watched had vanished. But the silence among the group was heavy. No one dared speak as they retraced their steps along the dirt path. Each of them was lost in thought, replaying the harrowing events that had unfolded within the lodge. Lisa kept the locket clutched tightly in her hand. Though the photograph had faded, its weight seemed to anchor her, reminding her of the girl and the countless others who had been trapped within the lodge's dark grip. She glanced back one last time at the ruins, a pile of smoldering timber barely visible through the trees. It was hard to believe something so malevolent had once stood there. When they finally reached the car, Tommy broke the silence. "Do we tell anyone about this?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Rachel leaned against the car, her face pale and drawn. "Who would believe us? We'd sound insane." Lisa hesitated. "Maybe not. The locket, the symbols. There's enough evidence to prove something happened out here. And if we don't tell the story, how will people know what to avoid?" Chris leaned on the hood of the car, shaking his head. "I get that, but who's going to publish an article about a haunted lodge? It's not exactly credible." Lisa didn't respond immediately. She stared at the locket in her palm, running her thumb over its surface. "It's not about credibility. It's about the truth. This isn't just some ghost story. People died here. Families deserve to know what happened to their loved ones." Rachel sighed, wiping her face with her sleeve. "I just want to go home. Forget this ever happened." "We can't forget," Lisa said, her voice firm. "We were chosen somehow to end this. If we ignore it, then their stories, what they suffered, will be erased." Tommy opened the driver's door and slid into his seat. "Let's talk about it later. Right now, I just want to get as far away from this place as possible." The others climbed in without further argument, the tension in the car palpable. Tommy started the engine, and they drove in silence down the winding forest road. As the miles passed, the group began to relax, though an undercurrent of unease remained. They spoke little, each lost in their thoughts. The sun was setting by the time they reached the outskirts of civilization. The sight of gas stations, streetlights, and scattered houses brought a sense of relief. They stopped at a small diner along the highway, their stomachs growling after hours without food. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as they slid into a booth near the back. A cheerful waitress approached, her name tag reading Darlene. "What can I get y'all?" she asked, her warm smile a stark contrast to the haunted expressions of her customers. "Coffee. Lots of it," Chris said, his voice hoarse. "Same here," Lisa added. "And maybe a menu?" Darlene nodded, scribbling on her notepad. "Coming right up." When she walked away, Rachel spoke up, her voice low. "So what now? Are we just supposed to go back to normal after this?" Lisa shook her head. "I don't think any of us can go back to normal. But we don't have to figure it all out right now." Tommy looked out the window, watching cars blur past on the highway. "I keep thinking about what the girl said, about the ones who built the lodge. If they created something like that, who's to say there aren't more places like it?" The thought hung heavy in the air. Lisa nodded slowly. If they built one lodge, they could have built others, or experimented with similar rituals in different places. Rachel shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Are you saying there could be more places like that out there?" "It's possible," Lisa said, "but that just makes it more important to tell this story. Maybe if we dig deeper, we'll find out who was behind it. And if there are other places like the lodge, we can warn people." Chris let out a low groan, running his hands over his face. "You're really planning on diving into this, aren't you?" Lisa met his gaze, her expression resolute. "I have to. I can't just walk away after what we saw." Darlene returned with their coffee and menus, breaking the heavy conversation. They ordered quickly, opting for comfort food: burgers, fries, pancakes. Anything to fill the hollow ache left by their ordeal. The drive back to their respective homes was quiet, each of them retreating further into their thoughts. Lisa dropped Tommy and Rachel off first, then Chris, before heading to her apartment. The locket remained in her pocket, a constant reminder of the promise she had made to herself and to the girl. Over the next few days, Lisa threw herself into research. She scoured old newspapers, archives, and online forums, searching for any mention of the lodge or its history. Her apartment became cluttered with printouts, books, and maps. She barely slept, her mind racing with questions. Who built the lodge? Why was it abandoned? What had happened to the people who disappeared there over the decades? Late one night, as she sifted through a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings, she found an article that made her breath catch. It was from 1954, detailing the disappearance of 6 children from a nearby town. The photograph accompanying the article showed a group of smiling kids. Lisa's eyes were drawn to one face in particular, the girl from the locket. "Mary Ellen Price," Lisa read aloud, her voice trembling. "Age 9. The article mentioned that the children had been sent to a summer camp in the woods but had never returned. Search efforts had turned up nothing, and the case had gone cold." Lisa leaned back in her chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. She wasn't sure what disturbed her more, the fact that the girl's identity had been erased for so long, or the realization that this was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Chris. "Found something. Call me." Lisa's heart raced as she grabbed her phone and dialed his number. He picked up after the first ring. "I was looking into those symbols," Chris said without preamble. "Found some old references to a group that used similar ones. They called themselves the Harbingers of Renewal." Lisa frowned, grabbing a notepad. "What were they? A cult?" "Seems like it," Chris replied. "They believed in using pain and suffering to cleanse the earth or something." The lodge might have been one of their experiments. Lisa scribbled furiously, her mind racing. Do you think there's any chance they're still around? Chris hesitated. I don't know, but if they are, we need to find them before they do something like this again. Lisa stared at the locket on her desk, its empty frame gleaming faintly in the lamplight. The girl's words echoed in her mind. You have to stop them. I'm in, she said finally. Let's finish what we started. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of research, phone calls, and sleepless nights. Lisa, Chris, Tommy, and Rachel, though initially hesitant to delve deeper, found themselves drawn back together by the shared trauma of the lodge. Each of them brought their unique skills to the investigation, piecing together fragments of a horrifying history that seemed too vast to comprehend. Lisa had become the de facto leader, her apartment serving as their base of operations. Maps and timelines covered every available surface, alongside photographs, old newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. Chris sat at the dining table, poring over a leather-bound book he'd found in an antiquarian bookstore. This group, the harbingers of renewal, they weren't just some backwoods cult. They had connections. Politicians, landowners, even a few prominent academics. Their influence was way bigger than we thought. Rachel, curled up on the couch with her laptop, glanced up. But what were they trying to do? I mean, the lodge, was it just some ritual site? More like a testing ground, Lisa said, running her fingers over a map spread out on the coffee table. Red pins marked locations tied to disappearances or strange phenomena. The symbols we saw, they weren't just random. They're part of a larger network, a ritual that connects multiple sites. Tommy leaned against the wall, arms crossed. And what happens when they connect all these sites? Another lodge? Something worse? Lisa didn't answer immediately. She stared at the map, her mind racing. If they succeed, they might create something permanent. Something that can't be destroyed. Chris closed the book with a grim expression. We need to figure out how to stop them before that happens. Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. And how do we even do that? We got lucky with the lodge. If there are more places like it, we can't just show up and hope to destroy them the same way. Lisa pulled out the locket, holding it up so the others could see. This locket saved us. It's more than just a keepsake. It's tied to the people who were trapped in the lodge. If we can figure out how it works, maybe it can help us stop the other sites. Chris raised an eyebrow. You think it's some kind of artifact? Maybe, Lisa said. Or maybe it's just a focus for their memories, their pain. Either way, it's connected. And I think it can lead us to the next site. The next clue came unexpectedly. Chris received an email from a professor he'd reached out to, Dr. Evelyn Grant, an expert on obscure occult practices. Her message was brief but intriguing. Asterisk, the harbingers of renewal are more than folklore. I have documents you'll want to see. Meet me at my office in Charleston. Bring the locket asterisk. The group made the 6-hour drive to Charleston, the locket stored securely in Lisa's bag. The tension in the car was palpable, each of them silently bracing for what they might uncover. Dr. Grant's office was tucked inside a crumbling brick building on the edge of the city. The interior smelled of old paper and dust, and the walls were lined with shelves overflowing with books. The professor herself was a small woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through them. So you're the ones who destroyed the lodge, she said, her voice laced with curiosity as she gestured for them to sit. Lisa hesitated. You know about the lodge? Dr. Grant smiled faintly. More than you might think. The harbingers were meticulous record keepers. I've spent most of my career piecing together their history. She opened a large folder on her desk, revealing pages filled with intricate symbols, photographs of dilapidated buildings, and faded letters. The lodge you destroyed was one of their oldest sites, but not the only one. They built at least 6 others across the country, all tied together by the same rituals. Chris leaned forward. And the rituals, what are they for? Dr. Grant's expression darkened. The harbingers believed in channeling human suffering to create power. They saw pain as a purifying force, capable of reshaping the world. The lodges were designed to concentrate and amplify that power. Rachel shuddered. And if they succeed, their ultimate goal, Dr. Grant said, was to summon what they called the eternal renewal, a cataclysmic event that would cleanse the earth and reshape it in their image. The lodges are focal points for that ritual. If too many are activated, she let the implication hang in the air. Lisa pulled out the locket, placing it on the desk. This belonged to one of the victims at the lodge. It helped us destroy it. Do you know why? Dr. Grant studied the locket carefully. Objects tied to the victims can become conduits for their energy, especially when the bond is strong. This locket may hold the key to disrupting their network. But you'll need to be careful. The harbingers have safeguards in place. Destroying one lodge might weaken the ritual, but it also draws their attention. Chris frowned. You're saying they know what we've done? Dr. Grant nodded. And they won't let it happen again. The professor's warning proved prophetic. As the group began their search for the next lodge, they noticed strange occurrences. Cars tailing them for miles, mysterious figures watching from a distance, anonymous threats appearing in their inboxes. The harbingers were making their presence known. But the group pressed on, their resolve hardened by the danger. Each new lead brought them closer to understanding the network, and to the next lodge. The trail eventually led them to a remote stretch of land in Montana, where an abandoned church stood hidden among the trees. The structure was decrepit, its stained glass windows shattered, but the symbols etched into its walls were unmistakable. This is it, Lisa said, her voice steady despite the chill that crept down her spine. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy with the same oppressive energy they'd felt at the lodge. Symbols glowed faintly on the walls, pulsing like a heartbeat. Chris gripped the poker he'd brought from the first lodge. Let's end this. The ritual site was larger and more complex than the lodge, its web of symbols sprawling across the floor and ceiling. As they began destroying the carvings, the building seemed to come alive, its walls shaking violently. From the shadows, figures emerged, twisted, humanoid shapes like those they'd faced before. But these were larger, more solid, their glowing eyes filled with malevolence. Keep going, Lisa shouted, smashing one of the symbols with a crowbar. The fight was brutal. The figures were relentless, clawing and snarling as the group fought to destroy the symbols. Lisa clutched the locket, its faint glow growing brighter with each blow they struck. When the last symbol was destroyed, a deafening scream filled the church. The figures dissolved into mist, and the oppressive energy vanished. The building began to collapse, and the group scrambled to escape, diving through the doors as the structure crumbled behind them. Breathless and battered, they stood in the moonlit forest, watching the ruins settle into silence. 2 down, Chris said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Lisa held the locket tightly, her gaze distant. And 4 to go. As they walked away, a faint whisper echoed through the trees. A promise and a warning. They will come for you. The forest around them seemed alive with whispers, carried on the cool night breeze. Lisa shivered, gripping the locket tightly as they made their way back to their car. The second lodge was gone, destroyed just like the first, but the toll on their spirits was evident. Each of them bore fresh scratches and bruises, both physical and emotional. Chris glanced back at the ruins of the church, barely visible through the trees. We're making progress, But it's not getting any easier. Rachel nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. They're getting stronger. Those things inside were nothing like what we faced at the first lodge. Lisa spoke without turning. The closer we get to stopping them, the harder they'll fight. The Harbingers won't let us finish this without a battle. Tommy, lagging slightly behind the group, muttered, "It's not just the Harbingers. It's the places. It's like they're alive. Like they know we're trying to destroy them." No one responded. They all felt it but couldn't bring themselves to say it out loud. Once they returned to their motel, the weight of their journey hit them. The tiny room, with its flickering fluorescent light and faded floral wallpaper, felt suffocating. Tommy tossed his backpack onto the bed and sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "We can't keep doing this without a plan," he said. "We barely made it out of that church." Chris paced by the window, peeking through the curtains as if expecting someone, or something, to be watching. "We need more than a plan. We need backup. Someone who knows what they're doing." Lisa sat cross-legged on the floor, the locket dangling from her fingers. "Dr. Grant might be able to help more." She said the Harbingers had documents and rituals. "There has to be something in those records that can help us fight them." Rachel leaned against the wall, her expression grim. She also said they'd come for us. And let's be real, they probably already are. The following day, Lisa called Dr. Grant from a payphone outside a diner. The line crackled faintly, but the professor's voice came through steady. "You've destroyed another lodge," Dr. Grant said, her tone a mix of relief and worry. "That's good news, but you're playing a dangerous game." Lisa filled her in on the second sight, describing the symbols, the creatures, and the overwhelming sense of resistance. "There's something you need to know," Dr. Grant said after a long pause. "The Harbingers created the lodges to protect their rituals, but they also built fail-safes. The more lodges you destroy, the more power the remaining ones will draw to themselves. The closer you get to the last site, the stronger it will be." Lisa's stomach churned. "So the final lodge could be unstoppable?" "Not unstoppable," Dr. Grant said, her voice firm. "But it will be the hardest to destroy. You'll need to be prepared for anything." The group spent the next few days recovering and gathering supplies. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The whispers in the forest, the glowing eyes she sometimes saw in her dreams. It all felt like a countdown to something catastrophic. Chris returned from a nearby town with a bag full of tools. Crowbars, hammers, ropes, and flashlights. "This isn't exactly military grade, but it's better than nothing." Rachel had scoured the internet for anything that might help, printing out pages of obscure rituals and protection symbols. Some of the stuff is weird, but if even one thing works, it's worth it. Tommy, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Grant said. If the last lodge is the most powerful, it might also be the key to ending all of this for good." Lisa looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then gestured toward the locket. "The girl, it's like she's guiding us. Maybe the lodges aren't just connected to each other. Maybe they're connected to her, too. If we can figure out what she wants, we might find a way to stop the Harbingers completely." Lisa nodded slowly. "You might be right, but we need to find the next lodge first." The locket led them to Kansas, to a sprawling field where an old grain silo stood abandoned. The air was thick and humid, the sky overcast. The silo was covered in vines, but beneath the foliage, the same glowing symbols were etched into the metal. As they approached, the temperature dropped sharply. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the dry grass. "This place gives me the creeps," Rachel whispered. "Even more than the last one." Chris tightened his grip on the crowbar. Stay sharp. We don't know what's waiting for us. The entrance to the silo was rusted shut, but with some effort, they pried it open. Inside, the air was stale and damp. The walls were lined with more symbols, and in the center of the floor, a massive circular engraving pulsed faintly. Lisa pulled out the locket, holding it up. The faint glow from the engraving intensified, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "This is it," she said. "Let's get to work." The group began smashing the symbols, their movements quick and coordinated. But as they destroyed each one, the silo seemed to react violently. The ground shook, and an ear-piercing screech filled the air. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, twisted, inhuman shapes that seemed to flow like liquid but struck with the force of steel. "Here we go again," Chris yelled, swinging his crowbar at one of the creatures. It dissolved on impact, but more took its place. Rachel frantically scribbled protective symbols onto the ground, hoping they would hold the creatures back. Tommy used a hammer to break the circular engraving, each strike sending tremors through the silo. Lisa clutched the locket, its glow now blinding. She could feel the presence of the girl, her voice faint but urgent in her mind. "Asterisk, you're close. Don't stop, asterisk." With a final, desperate blow, Tommy shattered the engraving completely. The creatures let out a collective wail, dissolving into mist. The silo began to collapse, the walls caving in as the group sprinted for the exit. They barely made it out before the entire structure crumbled, leaving nothing but a pile of rubble and a lingering sense of unease. Back at their motel, Lisa examined the locket. The glow had faded, but she could still feel its warmth. "3 down," she said softly. "We're halfway there." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The motel room felt oppressive as the group sat in silence, recovering from the latest ordeal. The faint hum of the air conditioner did little to cut the tension hanging between them. Outside, a thunderstorm rolled in, casting brief flashes of light through the thin curtains. Lisa sat cross-legged on the bed, the locket in her palm, its weight heavier than it should have been. Rachel finally broke the silence. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," she said, her voice trembling. "Every time we do this, it's like we're getting closer to something worse." Chris, who had been nursing a gash on his arm, looked up. "You think I'm not scared? I'd rather be anywhere but here. But if we stop, who's going to finish this? The Harbingers aren't just going to quit because we've destroyed 3 lodges." Rachel glared at him but said nothing. Instead, she turned to Lisa. "Do you even know what happens when we destroy all 6? What if we're just making things worse?" Lisa's gaze didn't leave the locket. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we don't have a choice. The lodges are part of something bigger. If we leave them, the Harbingers will win." Tommy, sitting by the window and watching the rain, spoke up. "I think we need help," he said quietly. "Real help. Not just Dr. Grant. Someone who can fight back if things go south." Chris scoffed. "And who do you suggest we call? The cops? A priest? Nobody's going to believe us." Tommy turned to face the group, his expression serious. "Maybe not, but I did some digging while you were all resting. There's someone who might. A guy named Marcus Hale." Lisa frowned. "Who's that?" "He's a journalist," Tommy explained. "Used to work for one of those fringe magazines that cover conspiracy theories and paranormal stuff. But he's legit. Ex-military. He's been investigating the Harbingers for years." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly did you find this guy?" Tommy shrugged. "There's a forum I've been following. People sharing stories about weird symbols and disappearances. His name kept coming up. I emailed him last week, just to see if he'd respond." "He did." Chris leaned forward. "And you didn't think to tell us?" "I wasn't sure if he was for real. Tommy admitted. But he knows things. Things we've seen firsthand. If anyone can help us, it's him. Lisa considered this for a moment, then nodded. Fine. Contact him. If he's as knowledgeable as you say, we could use the help. 2 days later, they met Marcus Hale in a small diner on the outskirts of a sleepy town in Colorado. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. His military past was evident in the way he carried himself, every movement precise and deliberate. "Tommy, right?" he said, shaking hands firmly before gesturing for everyone to sit. "And you must be the rest of the team." Lisa bristled at the word team, but she let it slide. "We've been following the lodges, trying to destroy them." Tommy said, "You know about the Harbingers." Marcus smirked. "Know about them? I've been chasing those bastards for over a decade. Got close to one of their sites in New Mexico about 5 years back. Didn't end well." "What happened?" Rachel asked. Marcus's smirk faded. "Lost 2 good men. Whatever you've been dealing with in those lodges, I've seen it too. Shadows that move, things that shouldn't exist. They're not playing games, and they don't make mistakes." Lisa placed the locket on the table. "This belonged to one of the victims. It's been helping us somehow. Do you know why?" Marcus examined it without touching it. "Yeah, I've seen objects like this before. They're tethered to the energy of the people who suffered in those places. The Harbingers feed off that pain, but objects like this can fight back. If you know how to use them." Chris leaned forward. "And do you?" Marcus's eyes met his. "I know enough to keep you alive. But if you're planning to take out the other lodges, you'll need more than luck and crowbars." Marcus agreed to join them, bringing with him an arsenal of equipment and knowledge. He taught them how to use salt lines and sigils to create barriers, how to identify the weak points in the lodge's ritual markings, and how to spot signs of Harbinger activity. His presence was both reassuring and intimidating, a constant reminder of how serious their mission had become. The locket, however, remained a mystery. While it had guided them to the lodges and protected them, it seemed to hold secrets even Marcus couldn't decipher. "It's like the girl is trying to tell us something," Lisa said one evening as they gathered around a campfire near their next target. "But I don't know what. Maybe she's waiting for the right moment," Marcus said, his voice low. "Or maybe she's afraid of what happens when you reach the end." The next lodge was in Arizona, hidden deep within a canyon. Unlike the others, this one wasn't abandoned. A small group of Harbingers was actively guarding it, performing rituals to strengthen its power. The group watched from a ridge, binoculars in hand. "There are at least 6 of them," Marcus whispered. "Armed too. This won't be easy. We can't just walk in and start smashing symbols," Chris said. "They'll kill us before we even get close." "We need a diversion," Lisa said. "Something to draw them away from the lodge." Marcus nodded. "I'll handle that. You focus on the symbols. Once they're destroyed, the site will collapse just like the others." The plan was risky, but they had no choice. Under the cover of darkness, Marcus set off a series of small explosions, drawing the Harbingers away from the lodge. Lisa, Chris, Rachel, and Tommy slipped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior was suffocating, the walls covered in pulsating symbols. The air hummed with energy, and the sound of distant chanting echoed through the cavernous space. "Split up," Lisa ordered. "Destroy as many as you can." They worked quickly, smashing the carvings and scattering the ritual objects. The lodge seemed to fight back, the ground shaking violently as the symbols were destroyed. Shadows began to coalesce in the corners, forming into the same twisted figures they'd faced before. Lisa clutched the locket, its glow intensifying. "We're almost there." As the last symbol shattered, A deafening roar filled the lodge. The figures dissolved, and the structure began to collapse. The group barely made it out, joining Marcus at the ridge as the lodge crumbled into dust. "That's 4, Marcus said, his face grim. "But the closer we get, the harder they'll hit back." Lisa stared at the locket, its glow fading once more. She couldn't shake the feeling that the girl's voice was growing louder, more insistent. "We're running out of time." The days after the Arizona lodge crumbled into dust were filled with a mounting sense of urgency. The destruction of 4 lodges should have been a victory, but each step they took toward the next site felt like they were walking deeper into a storm that would consume them all. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away faster than they realized. The harbingers were relentless, and with every lodge they destroyed, the opposition grew stronger. The locket, while still offering guidance, seemed to grow heavier in her hands. Every night, she would lay it beside her on the bed, staring at it as if it might reveal its true purpose. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, had become a necessary part of their team, but even he was beginning to show signs of strain. He kept his usual calm, but there were moments when his eyes flickered with doubt. They were pushing toward the last 2 lodges, but neither of them knew what awaited them at the end of this seemingly endless journey. They had just left New Mexico when they got the call. It was Rachel's phone that rang, a number they didn't recognize. "It's Dr. Grant," she said, showing the screen to the others. Lisa motioned for her to answer. "Dr. Grant," Rachel said into the phone. The professor's voice crackled through the receiver. "I've been tracking something. It's getting worse. I've seen evidence of harbinger rituals spreading beyond the lodges. People are starting to disappear, and I don't think it's just because of the sites anymore. They're trying to pull in more than just power. They're trying to pull something through." "Pull something through?" Lisa repeated, a knot forming in her stomach. "Whatever they're trying to summon, it's bigger than anything we've faced before. It might even be tied to the origin of the lodges. You have to stop them before they complete the ritual." "We're on our way to the next lodge," Lisa said, glancing at Marcus, who was watching her intently. "Good," Dr. Grant said, but there was hesitation in her voice. "But be careful. The closer you get to the end, the more dangerous it will be. You've seen what happens when you break one of those symbols. Things get unstable. The last lodge will be unlike any of the others. Be prepared for anything." "Understood," Lisa replied, then hung up the phone. She turned to the group, her face pale. "The final lodge won't be just a fight. It will be a battle against whatever the harbingers are trying to summon." Rachel looked at the others. "Do we even know what that is?" "No," Marcus said, his voice low. "And that's the problem." They spent the next few days on the road, the weight of Dr. Grant's warning lingering like an invisible hand on their shoulders. The air in the car was thick with unspoken thoughts, the landscape outside passing by in a blur of desert and mountains. Each of them was thinking the same thing. They didn't know what awaited them, but it would be worse than anything they'd faced before. Their next destination was an old mansion tucked deep in the Louisiana bayou. It was rumored to be haunted by strange creatures, and whispers in the local community spoke of unusual disappearances. This lodge, however, wasn't a forgotten relic like the others. It was actively being used. As they neared the mansion, the atmosphere around them began to change. The usual sounds of nature seemed muffled. The air felt oppressive, heavy with humidity and an unnatural stillness. The trees that surrounded the mansion were twisted, gnarled like claws, and the sky above was thick with dark clouds, promising rain. "This place feels wrong," Tommy muttered as they parked the car at the edge of the overgrown driveway. "I don't think we need to wait for the rain," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's already here." They all piled out of the car, and Lisa took the locket in her hands. the soft glow within it faint but steady. As they approached the mansion, the feeling of being watched intensified. There were no lights in the windows, yet they could sense movement beyond the glass. Marcus moved ahead, taking the lead, his military training kicking in as he quietly checked the perimeter. "We're not alone," he said, his voice barely audible. "There's movement inside." Lisa clenched her fists. "We don't have time to waste. Let's go." The front door creaked open with ease, as if it had been waiting for them. The group stepped into the dark hallway, their flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. The mansion was decaying, the floorboards creaking under their weight. But it wasn't just the decay of age. They could feel the weight of the ritual that had been performed here, the power that seemed to cling to every inch of the building. The air was thick with the smell of something burning, and in the distance, faint chanting could be heard. It was a low murmur at first, but as they ventured deeper into the mansion, it grew louder. Lisa stopped, holding up a hand. "Listen." The chanting stopped abruptly, and the stillness that followed was almost suffocating. Then, from the darkness ahead, figures appeared, clad in tattered robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They advanced toward the group in an unholy procession. "The Harbingers." "Get ready," Marcus hissed, pulling out a small vial of salt. Before anyone could react, one of the figures raised its hands, and the ground beneath them trembled. The walls seemed to pulse with a sickly energy, and the air thickened. Shadows stretched out, taking form like living things, as the Harbingers began their ritual. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. They had to act quickly. "Focus on the symbols," she shouted, drawing the others' attention to the walls. Strange, intricate markings were etched into the walls, glowing faintly as if alive. The symbols were connected by thin, glowing lines that seemed to pulse with dark energy. "Break the symbols," she ordered again, moving toward one of the markings. The others quickly followed her lead. Chris, with his crowbar, swung at the symbols with all his might, while Rachel and Tommy worked together to break the ones etched into the floor. Marcus, meanwhile, set salt lines around them, muttering protective chants under his breath. But the Harbingers weren't backing down. They circled around the group, chanting in an ancient tongue, their voices rising into a shrill crescendo. The ground beneath them buckled, and the ceiling cracked, as though the house itself was trying to tear itself apart. Lisa felt a sudden rush of fear, but then she remembered the locket. She grabbed it, holding it up high, its glow now blinding, casting a powerful light that pushed back the shadows. The Harbingers recoiled, their chanting faltering. "We're almost there," Lisa said, more to herself than anyone else. "We can end this." The moment she spoke those words, the final symbol shattered under Chris's blow. The energy in the room surged, sending a shockwave through the mansion. The figures in front of them screamed, their forms disintegrating as the ritual's power collapsed. But the destruction didn't stop there. The mansion itself seemed to be unraveling, the walls collapsing inward. Lisa barely had time to grab the locket before a portion of the ceiling caved in, forcing them to run. "Out! Now!" Marcus shouted, pushing everyone toward the exit. They made it outside just as the mansion crumbled to the ground. The storm that had been threatening finally broke, and rain poured down in sheets, washing away the remnants of the lodge. They stood in the mud, soaked and exhausted, watching the wreckage smolder. "That's 5, Tommy said, his voice hollow. Lisa wiped the rain from her face, her gaze distant. "One more to go." But as they stood there, the locket in Lisa's hands began to glow once again. And this time it wasn't faint. The light it emitted was bright, blindingly so. The girl's voice whispered once more in Lisa's mind, clearer than ever. "You've come this far. but the final choice is yours. As the storm raged around them, the group stood in stunned silence, the wind whipping through the trees and the sound of thunder crashing like the very earth itself was being torn apart. Lisa held the locket in her hand, its light now brighter than it had ever been. The faint voice in her mind, the girl's voice, lingered, echoing through her thoughts. Asterisk, you've come this far, but the final choice is yours, asterisk. The words sent a chill through Lisa's spine. She had no idea what this choice was, but the gravity of the statement weighed heavily on her. She looked down at the locket again, the delicate silver chain now seeming impossibly heavy in her palm. Rachel, standing beside her, noticed the shift in Lisa's demeanor. "Lisa," she asked, her voice filled with concern. "What's going on? What do you mean, the final choice?" Lisa shook her head, looking up at the others, her gaze clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know. The locket, it's telling me something, but I don't understand what it means." Tommy stepped forward, the rain drenching his clothes and hair, but his eyes were sharp, unwavering. "We're almost there, aren't we? The final lodge. If we take this down, we can stop the harbingers for good, right?" "Maybe," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "But we can't ignore the fact that the closer we get, the more dangerous this is becoming. Every time we destroy one of the lodges, the energy we're disrupting seems to fight back even harder. Whatever this is, whatever the harbingers are trying to summon, it's not just another ritual. This is something far worse. And you're right, Tommy, the locket is part of this, whether we understand it or not." The rain poured down harder, the cold biting at their skin, but Lisa couldn't tear her eyes away from the locket. She could feel its power, pulsing in her hand, thrumming with an energy she hadn't experienced before. It felt alive, and somehow, it felt as though it was connected to something far larger than any of them. The girl's presence seemed to grow stronger, almost as if she were trying to guide them toward something, toward the final lodge. But what if they were wrong? What if their actions were only feeding into something darker, something they couldn't control? Lisa's mind raced, and for a moment, she thought about turning back, leaving it all behind. The last lodge, the harbingers, the locket. Maybe it was all a mistake. But then she remembered the faces of the victims they had seen along the way. Their pain, their suffering, their lives stolen away. If they didn't stop the harbingers now, there would be more victims, more innocent lives claimed by whatever twisted force the harbingers were trying to bring into the world. "No," she whispered to herself. "We have to finish this." It took another 2 days of driving before they reached their destination. The small, forgotten town of Riverton, nestled deep in the woods of Maine. The final lodge was said to be hidden within the dense forest on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of the local community. People had disappeared over the years, whispers of strange happenings and unnatural occurrences surrounding the place. But as they pulled up to the edge of the forest, the atmosphere was eerily calm. The air felt still, almost too still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "There it is," Marcus said, pointing toward the edge of the woods. Through the trees, the shape of an old stone building could be seen, its silhouette barely discernible in the growing dusk. Lisa's grip on the locket tightened. This was it, the final lodge, the end of the road. She felt a pang of unease, but she pushed it aside. "Let's go," she said. "We don't have much time." They moved quickly through the forest, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. The trees seemed to close in around them, the darkness growing deeper with every step they took. The distant sound of wind rustling through the leaves was the only noise they could hear, but it didn't seem like the usual forest sounds. There was something different, something unsettling in the air. As they approached the lodge, Lisa could feel the oppressive weight of the place bearing down on them. The building was ancient, crumbling in places, with ivy crawling up the stone walls. A sense of dread filled the air, thicker than it had been in any of the other lodges. This wasn't just another site to destroy. This was the heart of it all. The final act in a twisted ritual they had been unwittingly caught in. "Stay close," Marcus said, his voice low. "Whatever's inside, we don't know what we'll be up against. Keep your eyes open." Lisa nodded, clutching the locket in her hand as they stepped through the broken doorway of the lodge. The interior was dim, the walls lined with dark symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, its surface etched with strange markings, the edges slick with what could only be blood. But what caught their attention wasn't the altar, it was the figure standing before it. The girl. Her pale skin was almost translucent in the dim light, and her eyes glowed faintly, like pools of water reflecting the moon. She stood tall and still, as though waiting for them, her long hair cascading around her like a dark veil. And in her hand, she held the same locket that Lisa had been carrying for all these weeks. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. This was the girl from the visions, the one who had guided them, the one whose presence had been intertwined with the lodges and the harbingers. "Who are you?" Lisa asked, her voice shaky but determined. The girl didn't speak. Instead, she stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. She raised the locket high, and the light that emanated from it intensified, bathing the room in a brilliant glow. The symbols on the walls began to shift and writhe, twisting into shapes that defied logic. "We've been following your path," Lisa continued, taking a step forward. "We've destroyed the lodges, we've fought the harbingers, but we still don't understand why. What are you trying to tell us?" The girl's eyes seemed to pierce through Lisa, as if she could see every doubt, every fear that had been festering in Lisa's heart. Finally, her voice echoed through the room, a voice soft but clear. "The lodges. They were never meant to be destroyed. They are the prisons of the old ones, the ones who were bound long ago. But the harbingers, they seek to free them, to bring them into this world, where they will consume everything asterisk." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. "Then why guide us? Why give us the locket?" The girl's expression was sorrowful, almost pained. Because the only way to stop the harbingers is to replace them. You must become the gatekeepers, the ones who bind the old ones once more asterisk. The words hit Lisa like a physical blow. She felt dizzy, the weight of the responsibility crashing over her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "We can't. We didn't sign up for this. We just wanted to stop them." "I know," the girl said, her voice filled with sadness. "But it is the only way. The harbingers cannot be stopped unless you take their place. You must be the ones to guard the lodges, to keep the old ones from breaking free. The room seemed to close in on them, the walls pulsating with dark energy. The air grew thick, and Lisa could feel the oppressive weight of the choice pressing down on her. The girl stepped forward again, placing the locket in Lisa's hand. "You must decide. The future of everything depends on it. Lisa stood frozen, the locket heavy in her palm. She could feel the darkness swirling around them, the tension in the air rising to an unbearable level. This was the moment, the choice that would determine the fate of the world. Would they take the mantle of the harbingers and become the guardians of the lodges? Or would they destroy everything and risk letting the ancient horrors loose upon the world? The choice was hers, and with a deep breath, Lisa made her decision. "We'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "We'll stop them. We'll protect the world." The girl's face softened, and she nodded. The locket's glow intensified, flooding the room with light. And then, in a flash of blinding brilliance, everything went dark. When Lisa woke, she was lying on the cold stone floor of the lodge, her body aching. The others were scattered around her, unconscious but alive. The air in the room was still, the oppressive weight of the ritual gone. The girl was gone, but the locket remained in Lisa's hand, and with it the weight of the decision she had made. They had won, but the true cost was only beginning. The room was silent, save for the distant rumble of thunder outside as the last echoes of the ritual faded away. Lisa slowly sat up, her head spinning as she looked around at the group. The others were starting to stir, blinking in confusion as they regained their bearings. "Is it over?" Tommy asked, his voice hoarse as he rubbed his temples. Lisa glanced at the locket still clutched in her hand. The light had dimmed, its once strong glow now faint, almost like a whisper of what had come before. She felt the weight of the decision she had made, the mantle of responsibility that now lay upon her shoulders. They had stopped the harbingers from releasing the old ones, but the cost was not one she could easily bear. She turned her gaze to the others, their faces a mix of exhaustion and relief. But there was something more, a quiet understanding in their eyes, as if they too knew that this battle was far from over. The harbingers had been defeated, but the path forward would be fraught with its own dangers. Lisa stood up, her legs unsteady, but she felt a sense of resolve begin to settle within her. The girl's voice, though quiet now, still echoed faintly in her mind. You are the guardians now. It is your duty to protect the world from what lies beyond *. They had made it through the worst of it, but there would be no going back to their old lives. The world they had known, that world of normalcy, was gone. The lodges were still out there, and though they had sealed away the greatest threat, there would always be something lurking in the shadows, waiting. Rachel, standing beside Lisa, placed a hand on her shoulder. "We did it," she said softly, "but we'll have to keep moving forward." Together, Lisa nodded. Together, she agreed. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were no longer just survivors. They were the new protectors. They had a purpose now, and they would guard the world against the dark forces that sought to tear it apart. The others slowly got to their feet, exchanging weary but determined glances. There was no more time for rest, but before they left the lodge for the final time, they took one last look at the altar. The markings had faded, the power gone. The lodge, once a place of darkness, was now empty, its purpose fulfilled. The spirits of those who had fallen had been laid to rest, and the world was safe for now. As they exited the crumbling lodge and stepped out into the clearing, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a wet, quiet calm. The storm had passed, and the sun was beginning to rise, casting pale light across the horizon. It was a new day, a day that marked the end of one journey and the beginning of another. Lisa breathed in the cool morning air, the weight of the locket still heavy in her hand. But there was a sense of peace now, a knowing that whatever came next, they were ready for it. They had faced unimaginable horrors and survived, and they would continue to fight no matter what. Together, they walked into the light of the new day. And now, as the story of their journey fades into the night, I wish you a peaceful rest. May your dreams be free of shadows, and may you find tranquility in the quiet moments that follow. Good night, and may your sleep be filled with sweet, beautiful dreams.